You're listening to Dateline Latin America, Tear Gas and Tango with
Joe Goldman, 37 years with ABC News, then with UPI, with The Village Voice, and many other.
And me, Daniel Schweimler, originally from London, formerly of the BBC, 19 years, and more recently with Al Jazeera English across Latin America.
They'll be sitting at a kitchen table in Buenos Aires talking about their journalistic adventures across the region, covering earthquakes, flooding and fires, talking to presidents, charlatans, sports stars and other newsmakers. In short, journalism and the state of the world.
Hello! Daniel, how are you?
I'm good, Joe. Thank you very much. Good to see you're recovered. And it's not a country you want to get sick in, really, Argentina at the moment, is it? So we were going to talk about Bolivia today, but there's been breaking news. We're angry, so we've decided to change the topic. We're going to talk about...
We're going to talk about scandals and how the scandals have really put this government, I wouldn't say on the offensive, I would say really in deep, deep, dark shape at this point. I don't know what they're doing. Because if it was on the offensive, they would go on the offensive. We haven't seen anybody try to talk about this. Let's talk about the scandals and what's going on.
I mean, it's not the first scandal this government's had. What have they been in office since December 2023? So they've been in office for a fair while. But this is the biggest, and it's got closer. Well, it couldn't really get much closer. It's hit very hard Karina Milei, the president's sister, and his number one aide, I guess you would call her. So very close.
Yeah, it's certainly not the first scandal. You could probably use all your fingers on your two hands, to count the scandals at least in the first year and a half of this government. But they just keep getting worse, I would say.
And this one, the whistleblower, if we can call him that, Diego Spagnuolo, was Javier Milei, President Milei's best friend.
And lawyer.
And lawyer, yes. And they met because they were spewing the same vitriol on X, or whatever it used to be called. And they met in that way. When Javier Milei came to office, the one person he had to give a role to, with all the other people who were helping him get to office, was his friend, his best friend, his lawyer, Diego Spagnuolo, who he made the head of Andes, which is the body, the agency which distributes aid, medicines to disabled people.
Or doesn't distribute aid and medicines to disabled people.
No, in this case, no, simply because part of the libertarian, let's cut everything with a chainsaw, government spending. One of the first, the most obvious to his mind, people to be cut were the weakest. People with disabilities.
Yes, so, absolutely.
Okay, that in itself bad enough, serious enough to hit the weakest in society hardest. That you could say that in itself is a scandal, but you could also argue is politics. But it's even worse than that.
Yeah, we had a situation where over 100,000 disabled persons. Remember, we're in a country of about 49, 50 million people. They were summarily cut from their very meager monthly pensions as disabled people, pensions of about $150 a month. And it was just cut. And they had to prove their disabilities. The government didn't stipulate how they had to prove that, where they had to go to prove that. It was just a complete chaos.
Which in itself is bad enough. That's serious. And the argument always is there's not enough money. We need to cut back. We need to control inflation. Yet at the same time, according to these recordings made, we think, by Spagnuolo, the now ex-head of the Disability Agency, members of the government were taking bribes from the pharmaceutical companies to employ them. One in particular, Suizo-Argentino Pharmaceuticals, were alleged to be paying up to $500,000, $800,000 a month to get the contracts to supply these drugs to the government to then disperse to disabled people. Yet the money was going into the pockets of, first and foremost, according to Spagnuolo, the president's sister, Karina.
Yep. They were talking about huge amounts of money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars a month was changing hands. This is part of an investigation. I have to say the judge, Casanello, and the prosecutor who I've talked with many times, Franco Picardi, they are very honest and hard-working judicial employees, something very rare in Argentina these days, especially in the federal judges. And they're going to get to the bottom of this.
And they've ordered raids on various properties. One of them to the offices of Suizo, Argentina, where the owners go by the name of Jonathan and Emmanuel Kovalivkin, were caught red-handed running out with bags or envelopes with up to $266,000 in them. So they're innocent until proven guilty, but the question will be asked, where were you going with all that money?
Dan, when was the last time, Daniel, that you carted around $260,000 in envelopes? When was it?
Yeah, well, we won't go into that now,
okay,
but yes.
Okay.
But then I'm not an elected representative or a guy supplying pharmaceuticals to the government to then distribute to its disabled people. So 3% was the figure being talked about. So there have been demos now.
Well, they actually were saying that it was 5%, and they increased it by 3%. And Spagnolo got mad about that increase. He was saying, why should we pay that much more? And that was the reason why. But by the way, the tapes that have come out were made a year ago. So we don't know what's happened in the interim regarding, were there more payments? Were there other payments? Were there increased payments? We do know that the 3% increment apparently was for Karina Milei.
Yeah,
The
and
president.
there's been demos, and one of the banners that people will hold up is simply the banner stating 3%. You know, we know what
That's
that is,
right.
asking for questions to be answered. And when Spagnolo, I mean, like a good friend, he went to the president and said, listen, Javier, there's this scandal going on, and your sister is taking money. And so what did he do? Rather than say, thanks a lot, compadre, he sacked him.
Yeah.
So he's made an enemy. His former best friend is now and lawyer is now one of his greatest enemies, and we're probably the one who's feeding these tapes to the media, where his voice has been recognised. But then so has Karina, the president's sister, and nephews, relatives of the former president Carlos Menem. Lule Menem and Martin Menem have been implicated.
Martin
Government
Menem, who's
ministers.
a very important figure in the Congress. You know, it's a scandal that really touches all kinds of different parts of this government. And it comes on really just behind the scandal over fentanyl.
Yes. Yeah.
The huge scandal where approximately 100 people have died, maybe more, we don't know, because it's apparently, well, you know more about it because you were covering.
We did a story last week. I mean, I think something like 158,000 vials of fentanyl produced by one particular company, HLB Pharma, were distributed around the country last December. The scandal only came to light in May when several patients at a hospital in La Plata, in Buenos Aires province, died. Totally unconnected cases, they thought, until they realised, the doctors and the medical staff realised, that the common link was they'd all been injected with fentanyl, used in anaesthetics, used as a painkiller, and then started to piece things together and realised that these cases had been cropping up around the country. And, you know, it's a huge country, nearly all private hospitals. The one in particular we went to the Hospital Italiano in La Plata, where this came to light. Demonstrations outside, families of the victims, 96 at the last count. They've managed to find some of these vials, the majority of them, but 28% of the 158,000 haven't been accounted for. So could well have been used. So 96 confirmed dead so far, but who knows how many more. It's a difficult process to try to link the injection. Some of the patients have died. It wasn't realised at first they had been injected with contaminated fentanyl. They may well have been cremated, so they're not going to get those bodies back. So there's a big forensic operation going on now, so the numbers are likely to rise quite substantially. But 96 so far is pretty horrendous. We went down to Chascomús, 2-hour drive out of Buenos Aires, first of all to the hospital in La Plata, then nearby town of Chascomús, interviewed the mother of one of the first victims, 18-year-old boy, who had had a motorbike accident, had head injuries, was treated at the hospital in La Plata. His mother was told he was progressing well. His mother was a nurse and, understood the terminology being used, and thought he was progressing well. And all of a sudden, a couple of days later, he's not doing so well. He has a high fever, and he has these 2 bacteria that antibiotics are not responding to, are not treating. A couple of more days later, he died. 18 years old, prime of life. So obviously, devastated mother, devastated families. Family member is acting as a lawyer for her family and several others in that region. And it's unbelievable. And the other thing I was thinking was this poor medical staff, the doctors and nurses, administering the drug without any knowledge that it's contaminated, now have to live with that on their consciences, that they have killed, unknowingly, some of their patients because of this contaminated fentanyl.
We should mention, Daniel, that over the years, Argentina's medical system is one of the tops, not only in South America, Latin America, but is really recognized throughout the world as a great system that has been ripped apart, not only by this government, but by various governments. But we should mention, during the pandemic, I think they did a masterful job, for the most part, of dealing with the pandemic. There was even, I remember in the first few weeks of the pandemic, how people applauded at 8 o'clock at night, the medical nursing staff, the EMT people, they were applauded. At 8 o'clock, everybody went out and applauded them for what they were doing during the pandemic. That did not last long.
No. I remember the first health minister was found to be giving the early vaccines to his friends and family, and he got rid of, the then President Fernandez got rid of him, and then did the remarkable thing, he appointed a doctor. Imagine that, a doctor as a health minister. And she was great. I mean, she did kind of get things back on track and, started to bring in the Chinese and the Russian vaccines because the Americans were too expensive, weren't they? Americans and the Europeans. And I was treated with Sputnik and, survived to tell the tale.
Me too.
So that was all fine. What the difference now under this current government is regulation with the cutbacks, severe cutbacks to government spending, regulation of food industry, of the medical industry has been cut back drastically. So it's quite likely that there was either no examination of the place where these fentanyl vials were being stored, just outside Ramallo, just out an hour or so outside of Buenos Aires, or they went and didn't do a very thorough job. Somehow they were allowed out onto the open market. Staff who work there, ex-employers and then employees, are saying that the conditions were terrible, that nobody was, regulating, nobody was examining, giving them, passing them to release this fentanyl into the markets. And they were being transported in trucks, which were also transporting food and other things, left out on pallets out on the forecourts, and under the sun, kind of victim of the weather. So they weren't being, health measures were not being applied adequately.
Some of the figures we're seeing from the government figures, when they're not doctored, especially medical figures are doctored, I guess. But whatever. We're seeing figures coming out. For example, the group that really takes control, it's like the FDA in the United States, the ANMAT it's called, was cut by almost 30% in the first year. That meant a lot of their employees were given the Doge treatment, in other words, severed, chainsaw operated. So you had all kinds of problems with food going bad, with medications. The whole system has been put on red alert at this point.
I mean, the opposition, the Congress, to its credit, is trying to provide more funding for certainly people with disabilities, which President Milei, as soon as this happened, because he doesn't have as much support as he would like in Congress, used the presidential veto to say that's not going to happen. We are not going to be spending any more money on the disabled. And then last week, what happened was Congress voted to annul his veto.
That's right. They overrode the veto.
Which was the first major defeat I think he suffered in Congress. They tried to do the same with pensions, and his veto still stands there, so he didn't work with pensions.
By very little, but they got enough votes, and the government did, to not override that veto.
Yeah, so disabled people in theory should be, although he's promised to again go and veto the people trying to stop the vetoes. So politicians are determined to get this funding through for disabled people, but it's the disdain, the disrespect that both Milei and the ex-head of the disability agency, Mr. Spagnuolo, seem to show for disabled people. They openly insult them. There's a case of Spagnuolo meeting the mother of a 12-year-old boy with autism.
Ian Moche, a 12-year-old boy, who was literally criticized by the president of the country, a 12-year-old autistic child, on a public airwave. It's just beyond belief. Really, think about it for a second. And all this, he's basing all this on cutting budget, bring the budget down. As you look at things, what is the only thing in the only things in the budget that didn't suffer the chainsaw? The intelligence service, which was up by over 30%. Once again, the intelligence service can utilize that money as they wish. It's not controlled by anybody anymore. It used to be, but it's not under Milei. You also had the publicity. The press office has been hugely advanced to 240 people, including relatives of the press attaché, the press guy here, Manuel Adorni, and the presidency has been also advanced in its amount of money given. So those areas are not subject to the chainsaw.
And at the same time, I mean, the demo last week outside the Congress, while they were voting on this attempt to overturn the veto, people with disabilities, parents with kids with disabilities, protesting, and the ones we spoke to were all saying much the same. It's not, they just don't talk to us. We've had issues with previous governments, but at least we were negotiating. We were talking to them, they were talking to us, they were listening. Didn't always give us what we wanted, but at least we had some kind of form of negotiation, communication going. This government simply ignores us.
No, it's unbelievable, and this comes on top of the Garahan, the Infants Hospital, which is a center really not only for Argentina, but for Latin America. It's a children's hospital that's probably the best-known children's hospital in all of at least South America. They were cut in their budgets by up to 50%. The doctors working there, many of them have resigned. They cannot afford. I mean, at the same time these budget cuts are going on, the price of living, the inflation, even though the government talks about lowering the inflation, it's still high. Daniel, you and I can talk about how high the inflation is here. I just had to send a telegram to the United States yesterday. They wanted $170 to send a telegram to the United States.
Wow.
This country is crazy with money.
At the same time, has to be said, we've got legislative elections, midterm elections coming up in October, 26th of October. According to the opinion polls, if we can believe the opinion polls, Milei's approval rating is around about 45%, which for a president who's been embroiled in scandal, who's cut public spending to the bone, and he's been in office for coming up for 2 years, is fairly high.
Yeah, if the polls are correct, and we'll see in the election, we shall see. The first election coming up in just 10 days from now is the election in Buenos Aires province, about 40% of the population, and it's a generally Peronist or opposition population. So we'll see what happens there.
Well, we got some inkling of what might happen. Was that on Wednesday, Milei and his sister Karina were campaigning in Lomas de Zamora, right in the heartland of this, the conurbation around Buenos Aires, in Buenos Aires province. A lot of their supporters initially, and then a couple of blocks later, they got the full force, didn't they, of the opposition? People holding up these 3% banners saying, "Where's the money gone?"
Apparently throwing some rocks, but also throwing a new interesting protest, lettuce and broccoli at the president.
Okay, what does that mean?
I have no idea what it means.
That's one to investigate, isn't it? Maybe there was just a stand with spare broccoli there, and whatever was to hand.
But don't tell us that you're going hungry. No. But the president was forced to flee. One of the people with him was Jose Luis Espert, who's the main candidate for Congress in the whole province, and he's running a very vocal campaign. Interestingly enough, he's not responding to, in his last campaign, he ran for president in 2019, and part of the funds that he got was from a noted narco trafficker who's now been extradited to the United States. He also flew around the country in that campaign in the plane of that same narcotraficante. Interestingly enough, he's not mentioned that, and when he's been asked about it, he's walked away.
I mean, do you just think that because we've had so many of these scandals, I mean, as you mentioned, that under this particular government in office for less than 2 years, we had what do they call it, the meme coin, the Bitcoin scandal, where Milei on his social media recommended a particular coin, which collapsed soon afterwards, and investors lost something like $250 million.
Exactly. Investors not only in Argentina, but a lot in the US and Europe also.
Yeah. So we've had that, we've had other scandals as well, so it's not the first. I just wonder whether people have this idea that, well, they're all corrupt, aren't they? Shrug of the shoulders, that's just the way it is. I mean, over the years, we've had a fair few
I think the thing that really separates these scandals from other scandals that, I mean, Argentina, has certainly had its share of scandals. I once again go to Martín Cohen, a novelist here, who commented about the situation of the Milei government, that cruelty is in fashion. And that's the best way to describe what's going on. Because it's not only corruption, but you do corruption at the same time that you put in cruel measures. For example, the scandal of the warehouse that housed food for the poor, that the government not only didn't distribute, but they let the food rot. And they knowingly let the food rot. Clothing that was to be given out to poor were just, once again, allowed to be held up in rat-infested warehouses. The idea, people from the city government have been saying that people go into containers, they go into them unbelievably ignorant remarks about how they're doing that because they're going to sell stuff from there or something, not even feeling the poverty that they're seeing around them.
Yeah, but winning support, I wonder who they're winning support from by openly showing this disdain for those most vulnerable. I mean, we've seen it, again, Milei takes a lot of his lead from Donald Trump, and we've seen that from Trump very often, mocking people with disabilities, mocking those who have kind of served their country and, lost loved ones and whatever. We've seen plenty of it, and it doesn't seem to do him any harm amongst a certain sector of society. I suspect these same people are online sending, racist and sexist and homophobic, anonymous emails and messages in their spare time. There's plenty of those out there. I suspect they're the very same people, but Milei has certainly got some of those. So several scandals. I mean, there's been a long history, though, hasn't there? We've had, in recent years, the previous kind of conservative government of, Mauricio Macri, not nearly, plenty of corruption there as well, named in the Panama Papers, not just him, his father and his two brothers with millions of dollars stashed away in the undeclared money, is the people asking for people to have faith in the Argentine economy, invest in Argentina, the future lies here, yet the very same people don't invest their own legal perhaps earnings, who knows, legal, illegal earnings, and not willing to invest it in Argentine banks in their own country. What kind of nationalism, patriotism is that?
Yeah, we have a situation where we had a plane here in February and March over a week period that was emptying, unloading suitcases and loading up other suitcases at the local city airport without any customs control whatsoever. That's another investigation that's going on. It could be part of the investigation of the foreign debt, the IMF debt. Argentina now, I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, Argentina's debt to the IMF is $68.8 billion. That is more than the next 9 countries' debts put together. How did they get that debt? Well, Donald Trump had to okay both of those debts. The $45 to $57 billion that was handed out in 2018, and the $20 billion that up to now has been handed to Milei. Both those outlays were given to try to help that each of those governments get elected in following elections. That is not legal according to the IMF's own regulations. They should not influence elections.
I mean, this government, like most governments, came into office saying the last lot were all corrupt, we're going to end the corruption. It was one of the reasons I think people voted for him. He was a maverick, a bit strange, but he seemed to a lot of people to be an honest guy. Irrespective of everything else that was wrong with him, he seemed to be an honest guy. And that's proven not to be the case very early on. I mean, one scandal doesn't bring down a government, but there's an accumulation. The whole disability thing is particularly unpleasant, it seems, with all that implies. We'll see what happens, how many more scandals come to light once the floodgates open.
There's a tremendous amount that still has not been investigated here. Also, the justice system is not the best. The justice minister, a man who was investigated for possibly killing his own girlfriend, is a man who has come out against femicide, has cut back all programs of women in moments of need. There are no more hotlines for violence against women. And, the whole reasoning is, why should women get these programs and not men? Just these wild, crazy. This is the same justice minister who today is being investigated because he aided Tim Ballard, I think was his name, a U.S. citizen. He tried to clean the record of this man who's been accused of being a pedophile. So you have all these scandals just building one after another. We'll see what happens in the election. I'm very interested in the election.
I mean, I guess if these economic policies are seen to be successful, then people may excuse, again, like I said before, this is what happens, this is what politicians are like. Maybe they would excuse or just choose to overlook them. But the economy is not doing brilliantly. I mean, the peso is it's holding its own just about. They're putting a lot of effort, a lot of money into keeping the peso steady against the dollar, but it's looking very precarious. Interest rates are shooting up. So again, that will have an impact on people's everyday life. Unemployment's doubled. Poverty, we know, shot up. They managed to recoup some of that, but it's still very, very high. So we shall see. They will start to stop excusing these scandals, perhaps when the implications of these policies, start to hit home hard.
I think we're also seeing that even some of his sycophantic journalist people are suddenly not supporting him as much as they did. I think especially this last scandal with the disabled, with the handicapped, has really caused a rift even in his own group of people. his journalists are just not going all out there. He had a conference in Rosario on Friday night where he said he was going to address a major theme. Everybody thought the major theme was he was going to talk about the scandal. Instead, he started talking, he said, the major theme I'm going to talk about are the interest rates. And this was being covered live on television, and one of his sycophantic journalists said, "Oh my God, I can't believe he just said that." So you're seeing that that group of people are no longer his staunch allies.
Okay, well, we'll watch it crumble. We'll wait for more information to come out, more leaked recordings, I guess, and we'll talk about Bolivia next week, as we were due to, unless, of course, there's more breaking news, more scandals to discuss. But Bolivia's certainly on the cards.
Yeah, I think we have a little bit of time with Bolivia because the runoff election is not until October 7th, is it?
17th, I think.
17th,
yeah.
Okay.
17th,
so we have some time. So not to put off Bolivia, because we both love Bolivia. You know, if Argentina has another scandal, which is altogether possible, we might just delay Bolivia another week.
Okay, nice talking to you, Joe, as always. Take care.
You too, Daniel. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.